Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce Ariana Modirrousta-Galian. Ariana is a PhD, psychology PhD student at the University of Southampton. Her research focuses on using inductive learning and gamification to enhance people's ability to discriminate between true and fake news. And her research is very relevant to the type of stuff that we do. Thank you, Ariana, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully you don't just see yourselves. Okay, so I think I can... Is it annoying to have this in the hide self view? Well, that's just hidden me. There we go. That might be better. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah. Okay, I think you're muted, but I'll take that as a yes.
Okay, cool. It was muted, yes.
Cool, thank you. Perfect. So first, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to the talk today. And also thank you so much for attending. As Almog said, my name's Ariana Modirrousta-Galian, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Southampton. And today I'm going to be giving a talk titled Our Ongoing Quest to Create an Intervention that Improves True and Fake News Discrimination. Oh. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a quick outline to what I'm going to be talking about. So first, I'm going to look at current interventions or gamified interventions designed to help people spot fake news. Then I'm going to move on to the type of knowledge actually underlying true and fake news discrimination. And finally, I'm going to talk about using inductive learning to improve true and fake news discrimination. And I do want to say that these 3 points perfectly map out my 3 PhD papers for my thesis. The first one is luckily published, the second one's under review, and the third one is currently in progress. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, so starting off with current interventions or gamified interventions designed to help people spot fake news. Games designed to improve people's ability to spot online misinformation have recently become incredibly popular. And I think this really started having a boost in popularity around 2018, 2019. And the surge in popularity was quite great, specifically in psychology. And one of the most popular types of these games that serve this purpose are called gamified inoculation interventions. And I'm sure you've all heard of them. The 3 most popular types are Bad News, Go Viral, and Breaking Harmony Square. And they're all available free to play online. So you can go online right now, type them in, and you can play them. They take anywhere between, I think, 5 to 20 minutes to play, and they're essentially sold as a ways to help people improve their ability to detect fake news or manipulative strategies. And gamified inoculation interventions are informed by something called inoculation theory, which draws upon a medical analogy. So just like you have a vaccine that contains a really weakened dose of a virus, and you inject that into your body and it triggers an antibody response that then confers resistance against future disease. Well, analogously, inoculation theory suggests that by exposing people to weakened arguments against an attitude that they already hold, resistance can be conferred against future attacks on that particular attitude. And inoculation theory has recently been applied to online misinformation research, with researchers trying to create what they call a broad spectrum vaccine that generates mental antibodies against false or misleading online content. And the way that they do this is by exposing people to common techniques used to produce online misinformation to basically try and confer resistance against the online misinformation they might encounter in the future. And they use manipulative strategies such as the one on the screen, so polarization, polarizing language, discrediting opponents, trolling, which is essentially just taking the mick out of people online and conning them, conspiracy theories, impersonation, which I think is really relevant in Twitter today, especially since Elon Musk took over. I think the ability to pay for a blue check mark has just made this impersonation stuff skyrocket, which is super interesting. And also emotional language, so trying to trigger certain emotions, usually negative emotions, with the language used. And prior research investigating the effectiveness of these gamified inoculation interventions used pre-post designs, typically including control groups, but not always, in which participants rated true and fake news items before and after playing. And ratings were made on a scale ranging from 1, not at all reliable, to 7, very reliable, or from 1, not at all manipulative, to 7, very manipulative. So the experimental design typically looked like this. You'd have a treatment group where you have a pre-test and a post-test, and then in the middle, they play one of these gamified inoculation interventions. And then you also have a control group that also has a pre-test and a post-test, but in the middle, they either play Tetris, so unrelated to misinformation completely, or they just do nothing at all, so a no treatment control. And the way that these studies analysed their results was by usually looking at mean ratings for fake news items and comparing them between the pre-test and the post-test, and then doing the same with mean ratings for true news items most of the time, although sometimes they collected the mean ratings for true news items and just reported the fake news stuff. So they usually have two main hypotheses. The first is that gamified inoculation interventions will cause participants to rate fake news as less reliable or more manipulative. And the second is that gamified inoculation interventions will not cause participants to rate true news as less reliable or more manipulative. And they usually found evidence for this, although sometimes they did find that the games reduced belief in true news as well, but it was to a lesser extent than it did to fake news. So they concluded that these games were really effective. But the issue is that mean ratings are not ideally suited for examining intervention generality. Now, what do I mean by that? To determine the efficacy of these interventions, we think that it's vital to assess their generality. And by that, we mean their effect on both true and fake news. And that's because on the one hand, some interventions may only affect the intended behavior. So in this case, that would be reduced belief in fake news. But on the other hand, other interventions may affect the intended behavior as well as unintended behaviors, which in this case would be reduced belief in true news. And the problem here is that reduced belief in true news can have really bad consequences. So just as an example, if I were vaccine hesitant, which I'm not, but if I were, I could say, well, I don't want to take the vaccine because I think that they contain poisons. And that's me just believing in fake news. But then I could also say, I'm not going to get the vaccine because I actually don't think that they confer resistance against disease. And so that's me not believing in true news. So you have two different things going on here, believing in fake news and not believing in true news, that can lead to the same really harmful consequence. And so this is why we think that it's so important to look at how these interventions affect belief in true news and fake news. And mean ratings are just not the best way to do this. But receiver operating characteristic analysis, or ROC analysis, is ideally suited for determining the generality of interventions. And this is because it allows for discrimination and response bias to be measured separately. So discrimination in this context is the ability to distinguish between true and fake news. So this is what we want these interventions to do. Whereas response bias is just the overall tendency to rate all news as more true or more fake. So this is not what we want to do, because we don't just want to cause a bias. We actually want participants to be able to tell apart the two different types of news. And you can have a liberal response bias, so an overall tendency to rate everything as more true, or you can have a conservative response bias, so an overall tendency to rate everything as more fake. So if an intervention is specific and only affects the intended behavior, this will result in an increase in discrimination. So as an example, if someone plays one of these gamified inoculation interventions and it only reduces their belief in fake news, that's an increase in discrimination. That's great, because they can clearly tell them apart and say, that's true news, I'm going to believe that, but that's fake news, I'm not going to believe that. But if an intervention is overly general and affects the intended behavior as well as unintended behaviors, this will just cause a shift in response bias. So again, if someone plays one of these games and it reduces their belief in fake news and true news, that's just a bias shift, because they're no longer discriminating, they're just rating everything as more fake, which is a conservative response bias. But despite the usefulness of ROC analysis, unfortunately, it's barely been used in misinformation research. So we decided to use it to reanalyze the results of papers that examined the effectiveness of gamified fake news interventions. And we had 4 inclusion criteria. The study had to examine, obviously, the effectiveness of a gamified fake news intervention. Also, a scale pertaining to news veracity had to be included as a dependent variable. And this is because ROC analysis cannot be conducted on binary data. It can only be done on scale data. Ratings had to be collected for both true and fake news. That's the only way to look at discrimination and response bias. And finally, the raw data from the study had to be made available. And 5 studies met all of our inclusion criteria. And these were all on gamified inoculation interventions. So 4 of them looked at bad news and 1 of them looked at go viral. And I just want to give credit where credit is due here. These studies are all done, and the gamified inoculation interventions as well, by a group over at Cambridge that I'm sure you're all familiar with, led by Sander van der Linden. And I just want to say the open science that they do is great, and we're very appreciative of it, because we actually run into issues trying to get data from other studies where we wanted to look at their games, and we couldn't because they just didn't make the raw data available to us. So in terms of the method, we plotted ROC curves. And because I know that ROC analysis isn't typical in our field, I'm just going to run through a few steps on how we actually plot ROC curves. So first, you have to calculate the hit rate, which is the proportion of true news items that participants accurately categorize as true. And then you also have to calculate the false alarm rate, which is the proportion of fake news items that participants inaccurately categorized as true. But since ratings were made on a 7-point scale, the hit and false alarm rates have to be obtained by treating each level of the scale as a cutoff point. So that's scale value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So you start off with cutoff point 1. And essentially what you do is that any response that rates a true news item as a 1 or above is called a hit. And any response that rates a fake news item of 1 or above is called a false alarm. And because all participants are giving items a rating of 1 or above, when the cutoff point is 1, the hit rate and the false alarm rate is also 1. Then you move on to cutoff point 2. And here, any response that gives a true news item a rating of 2 or above is called a hit. And any response that gives a fake news item a rating of 2 or above is called a false alarm. So you end up with a slightly smaller hit rate and a slightly smaller false alarm rate. And you do this for every single point on the scale. So 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And this results in what you see on the screen, ROC curves. So on the screen, you can see 2 different ROC curves. I do want to point out these are all based on simulated data that I did. So it's not the real data just yet. It's just for illustrative purposes. So just as a refresher, discrimination is the ability to distinguish between true and fake news. And if you can see on the ROC curves here, there's a straight diagonal line. And that's just a reference line. So that's just what participants' responses would look if their discrimination was at chance level. So if they were just completely guessing, no idea whether it's true or fake, that's what their responses would look like. But the curve that you see would be participants' actual responses. So the further that this curve bows away from the diagonal, the better the discrimination, which is why you can see the graph on the left here shows worse discrimination than the graph on the right. And we can actually quantify discrimination by calculating the area under the curve. So an AUC of 0 is no discrimination, an AUC of 0.5 is chance discrimination, so that would be the straight diagonal line, and an AUC of 1 is perfect discrimination. And the good thing about ROC curves is that you can also look at response bias. So the overall tendency to rate all news as either more true, which would be a liberal response bias, or more fake, which would be a conservative response bias. And you do this by looking at the placement of the points on the ROC curve. So when it's a liberal response bias, the points cluster towards the upper right portion of the curve. When it's unbiased, they're sort of just evenly spread out. And when it's a conservative response bias, they cluster towards the bottom left portion of the curve. And you can quantify response bias as well by calculating the B prime D. So a B prime D of -1 looks like this. It's a liberal response bias. A B prime D of 0 is unbiased, and a B prime D of 1 would be an extreme conservative response bias. Okay, so now that we know what ROC curves are, here are the results of our reanalysis. So loads of ROC curves, there's 13, I think. And immediately you can see, so we've plotted ROC curves for each condition, study, and pre-test and post-test. So you can see that in the vast majority of cases, the ROC curves are overlapping. So this is showing that there doesn't seem to be an increase in discrimination because of playing these games, because it shows the pre-test, so before playing these games, and then the post-test, so after playing these games. But you might say, well, there are two exceptions there on the screen. You can see here that there seems to be an increase in discrimination in the follow-up test in both of these curves compared to the pre-test and the post-test. But I'd just like to draw your attention to the title of the ROC curves. This is the active condition, so that's the treatment condition, and this is the control condition. So this is where they played Tetris. And you can see that this improvement in discrimination is happening exactly the same in the control as the treatment. So clearly it's not specific to playing a gamified inoculation intervention. So we said, well, what's going on? We had a bit more of a look at the study, and we realized that what had happened is that different news items were used in the follow-up test than in the pre-test and the post-test, and they weren't counterbalanced. So all that was going on here was that the items used in the follow-up test were easier than the items used in the pre-test and the post-test. But it's kind of hard to get a holistic idea of what's going on here because there are like 13 ROC curves. So what we did is we carried out a meta-analysis, an internal meta-analysis on our results, and we found that in terms of the AUC effect sizes, so that's discrimination, there wasn't a significant difference between the treatments and the controls. So these gamified inoculation interventions weren't improving discrimination. But then we also did it for the pre-post B prime D effect sizes, so that's response bias, and we did find a significant increase in B prime D values in the treatments compared to the controls. And if you recall, a more positive B prime D is a more conservative response bias. So essentially what we find is that these games just cause people to rate everything as more fake. So what are the key findings? Gamified inoculation interventions did not improve participants' discrimination. That's their ability to distinguish between true and fake news. And instead, they simply elicited a more conservative response bias. So an overall tendency to rate everything as more fake. Now, without further research, it's really quite difficult to determine the cause of this conservative response bias, but we can speculate, and we did speculate. So the reasons that we came up with was, one, the interventions just cause participants to become skeptical of everything. And this kind of makes sense because participants are playing these games that teach them about all the manipulative strategies out there that can deceive you. And this might just trigger a schema where you're like, oh, I need to be careful because I might be being deceived. And so you just become more skeptical of everything, rate everything as more fake. Another explanation is that the interventions are actually effective in teaching participants how to detect manipulative strategies, but the issue is that these manipulative strategies are present in both true and fake news. So it just causes participants to consider everything as more fake. And this makes sense, right? We've all seen the clickbait headlines, whether it's true news or fake news, very polarizing language, very emotional language. And that's because most of the time, these news outlets are just trying to generate clicks. So it makes sense that that would be the case. And then the final explanation is more of a methodological one, which is that the number of true news items in the pretest was typically much lower than the number of fake news items, which may have caused participants to become less willing to rate items as true. So for example, in one of the studies, they used 18 fake news items and 3 true news items in the pretest. So if participants pick up on this, they might just say, well, if we just rate everything as fake, we're going to be right 18 out of 21 times. So it makes sense that they would, do that. Although I do want to point out that some of the studies that we reanalyzed did have a balanced number of true and fake news. So this final explanation can account for maybe some of the results that we had, but definitely not all of them. And I do want to do a shameless self-plug. So our paper was published in JP General, but unfortunately it's behind a paywall, so it is freely available on SciArchive. Okay, moving on to the second part of the talk, where we're going to look at the type of knowledge behind true and fake news discrimination. So why are interventions having limited success? And I don't just mean bad news go viral, I also mean others. We've tried ourselves to create some and they've just produced null effects across the board. So no effects on discrimination, no effects on response bias. There's also been other people that have looked at trying general fake news warnings that haven't worked. They've just triggered a more conservative response bias. So why is this happening? Why are we struggling with this? And so we took a step back and we realized that there's been no attention devoted to uncovering the nature of knowledge people use to discriminate between true and fake news. And without understanding how people tell apart true and fake news, how can we try and make informed attempts to improve their ability to do so? And so we took it up on ourselves to look at this, and we distinguished between two different types of knowledge, which is quite common in cognitive psychology. The first is explicit knowledge. So that's knowledge that is easily articulated. So for example, if I asked you, I don't know, what's the difference between England and Spain? You might say, well, Spain is to the south of England. In Spain, they speak Spanish. In some parts of Spain, there's tropical weather. And you might give me all of these different explanations that you can easily verbalize. So that would be explicit knowledge. But then you also have tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that is not easily articulated. So a good example of this is riding a bike. So if you know how to ride a bike, you can just get on one, ride into the sunset, and it's so easy. You don't even have to think about it. But if someone asks you, well, can you actually explain exactly how you're doing that? It's quite difficult. You know, there's a lot of things going on, verbalizing it can be quite hard. So that would constitute tacit knowledge. And to measure tacit and explicit knowledge, we can use self-report measures that are often used in artificial grammar learning experiments. So a typical procedure in these AGL experiments, as we call them, is that you start with the training phase, so where participants are exposed to exemplars of letter strings, for example, M, V, X, R, T, that follow a specific grammatical structure. Then they take part in a test phase where participants are asked to indicate whether a new set of exemplars follow the same grammatical structure as those from the training phase. And this is the crucial part. After each classification, they indicate what decision strategy they used. So for example, guess, intuition, rule, familiarity, or prior knowledge. And the way that the results from these procedures are typically interpreted is that when participants say that they're guessing or using intuition, that's indicative of tacit knowledge, because they either don't know what they're doing, they're completely guessing, or they're using intuition. So they're working based off of a hunch, which is quite difficult to explain, as you can't really verbalize that intuition. But if participants say that they're using rules or prior knowledge, that's explicit knowledge, because presumably if you're using specific rules or specific previous knowledge that you have, you should be able to verbalize that. And finally, if participants' classification accuracy is significantly above chance when they report that they're guessing, that's also indicative of tacit knowledge. And that makes sense, right? Because clearly they have the necessary knowledge because their discrimination is good, but they either don't know that they have that knowledge or they can't verbalize it because they say that they're completely guessing. And this is called the guessing criterion. And so what we did is we ran a pre-registered study that applied this self-report method of measuring tacit and explicit knowledge to a true and fake news discrimination task, where we had 327 US participants from Prolific rate the veracity of various news headlines on a Likert scale that ranged from 1, high confidence false, to 6, high confidence true. And after each veracity rating, they had to indicate the decision strategy that they used. And this could be one of the following: guess, intuition, rule, familiarity, prior knowledge, or other. And I should mention that all of these, apart from other, have been taken from previous artificial grammar learning experiments, but we decided to add other in case participants were using a decision strategy that we hadn't considered before. So if you were a participant in our study, this is what it looked like. You'd be shown with news headlines such as the one on the screen. And then you'd be asked, to what extent do you believe this news headline contains true or false information? And you could answer on this 6-point Likert scale. And then you'd be asked, what decision strategy did you use to make this rating? And you could say guess, your response was based on nothing but a pure guess. Intuition, your response was based on a feeling or a hunch, such that you had some confidence but couldn't explain why. Rule, your response was based on one or more rules, and the nature of those rules could be stated if asked. Familiarity, your response was based on feelings of familiarity due to having seen or heard about this news item before. Prior knowledge, your response was based on pre-existing knowledge about the general topic presented in this news item or other. So what did we find? Well, first, we were just interested in seeing how often participants picked each decision strategy. And so we looked at the frequencies and the relative frequencies, and immediately we saw that participants were mostly picking guess and intuition, which we were really quite surprised about, to be honest, at that time. So they picked guess 36% of the time and intuition 27% of the time, which is a combined 63% of responses. And if you remember, these two are indicative of tacit knowledge. And comparatively, they picked prior knowledge and rule a lot less. So prior knowledge 15% and rule 6% for a combined 21% of responses. And these are indicative of explicit knowledge. So right off the bat, we can see that participants are picking decision strategies that seem to be indicative of tacit knowledge a lot more than they're picking those that are indicative of explicit knowledge. Now, I do just want to draw attention to the familiarity and the other responses. So familiarity, they picked it 15% of the time. So they weren't all fully familiar with the item set, which is probably a good thing. And they only picked other 2% of the time. So I'm going to go on to our analysis later on that does break everything down per decision strategy, but we exclude other because there's just not enough responses to calculate a robust analysis. Okay, and then we plotted ROC curves, of course, and immediately you can see that their discrimination is quite good across the board. So for all veracity ratings on the top left, then guess, intuition, familiarity, prior knowledge, and rule veracity ratings, all of the curves are bowing quite nicely away from the diagonal. And this is corroborated by the AUC values. So you can see that all the AUCs are significantly above 0.5. But I just want to draw your attention to the guess ROC curve here. Because if you remember, the guessing criterion is when people's discrimination is significantly above chance, but they say that they're guessing. And that's exactly what's happening here. And that's also indicative of tacit knowledge. Now, in terms of response bias, if you just ignore the familiarity ROC for a second and you look at all the other ones, you can see that the B'(D)s are all slightly positive. So across the board, participants seem to have a general tendency to rate items as more fake. But the exception to this is when they're familiar with the news items. So then they have a slightly liberal response bias, so a slight tendency to rate everything as more true. So what are the key findings? Participants predominantly chose the guess and intuition decision strategies, which are indicative of tacit knowledge. They also showed above chance discrimination across all decision strategies and also separately for each, even when they said that they were guessing, which is evidence for the guessing criterion. And finally, participants showed a conservative response bias across all decision strategies and also separately for each, except for when they were familiar with the news items, for which they showed a slightly liberal response bias. So these results seem to show that tacit knowledge formed the dominant basis of participants' discrimination, and this can have quite important implications for interventions that aim to protect people from fake news. Because we know that several misinformation interventions that have provided explicit guidance have had limited success. So we know in terms of the bad news and the go viral, and also there was a really interesting study that looked at how fake news warnings affects participants' belief in true and fake news. And as I said earlier, that also just elicited a more conservative response bias. And this isn't too surprising because explicit instruction has actually been shown to interfere with learning that is based on tacit knowledge. And this has been shown in the context of motor skill learning, artificial grammar learning, and sequence learning. So to develop effective interventions, we recommend drawing inspiration from methods that improve the tacit knowledge that we use in everyday life, such as when learning a new language, instrument, or motor skill. And these include things like mentorship and repeated practice. So if you're going to learn a new instrument, what do? You practice over and over again, and you might get a teacher or a mentor to help you along the way. And I also just want to draw attention to this finding that was completely unintentional, but we actually replicated the illusory truth effect in our study, which is that repeated exposure to information increases its perceived truth regardless of its objective veracity. And we found this because when participants were completely unfamiliar with the news item, they had a tendency to rate everything as more fake. But when they were familiar with the news item, so when they'd had repeated exposure to it, they had a slight tendency to rate them as more true. So this was a neat little unintentional effect that we found. And again, our paper is on SciArchive. This one, just a disclaimer, it has not gone through peer review, so there are going to be changes associated with it. Specifically, we also looked at linear mixed models here, and I think that procedure needs to probably be updated. Okay, moving on to the final part of the talk, using inductive learning to improve true and fake news discrimination. So inductive learning is learning to distinguish between different categories by classifying exemplars from those categories and receiving immediate feedback on accuracy. So for example, if I were to give you a bunch of true and fake news items and tell you, okay, rate them as true or fake, and I'm going to give you feedback each time telling you whether you're correct or incorrect. That would be inductive learning. And this is essentially repeated practice, and it can be applied to true and fake news discrimination, like I just exemplified. But the issue is that we've tried this before in a published paper, and we actually found that it produced null results, so not great. So we thought, well, let's try and up the ante and see what happens. So we decided to implement different techniques that are known to boost inductive learning. And the ones that we chose were implementing an easy to hard schedule of exemplars. So you start with easy news items and you kind of work your way to harder ones. Also implementing blocked sequencing, which is presenting multiple exemplars from the same category in a row, and also interleave sequencing, which is exemplars from different categories presented in an intermixed order. Engaging in both passive inductive learning, which is just looking at exemplars, and then also active inductive learning, which involves classifying exemplars with feedback. And finally, making category level metacognitive judgments of learning. So every X number of news items that you rate, you're asked, what is the likelihood that you'll be able to correctly indicate whether a news item is true in a later test? And then you're asked the same thing for fake news items. And so that's exactly what we did. And we randomly allocated participants to one of two conditions, experimental and control. In the experimental condition, they took part in the first training block, which had passive inductive learning, easy to hard schedule, blocked sequencing, and category level metacognitive JOLs. And also they took part in training block 2, which was the same, but had different news items, and also had active inductive learning instead of passive, and interleave sequencing instead of blocked. And finally, they took part in a test phase where they just rated the veracity of various news headlines. In terms of the control condition, it was a no treatment control. So they just took part in the test phase. So what did we find? Well, here's the ROC curve. And I do want to point out that I hope you guys can see the numbers, but I've also showed the false alarm rate and the hit rate next to each point. So the first value that you see next to each point is the false alarm rate, and the second is the hit rate. So in terms of discrimination, we found that the AUC values in the treatment condition were significantly greater than the AUC values in the control condition. But there is a caveat: the Bayesian evidence was only anecdotal. So anecdotal evidence for the alternative, not ideal. In terms of the B'(D) values, we also found that the B'(D) values in the treatment condition were significantly greater than the B'(D) values in the control condition. And I just want to focus on that B'(D) finding for a little bit now. At face value, it seems to suggest that the treatment condition elicited more conservative responding than the control. But when you actually focus on the hit rates and the false alarm rates that you can see, or I should say false alarm rates and hit rates because they're in that order, you can see that the only difference between the treatment and the control is that the treatment had lower false alarm rates than the control. The hit rates were almost identical. You can see these across the points, but it's just the false alarm rates that are decreasing. So all that means is that participants in the treatment condition are better at detecting fake news than those in the control. But despite this, you see that the B'(D) values vary between conditions because they're just determined by the sum of the hit and false alarm rates. So the smaller the sum, the greater the B'(D) values, and vice versa. And we've actually encountered this sort of misleading finding before. every response bias measure in signal detection theory is measured by the sum of the hit and false alarms, which is why these sort of misleading results occur. And you have to look at the hit rates and false alarm rates. And we also found this in the reanalysis paper. So when we reanalyzed Rosenbeek and van der Linden in 2019, we said bad news improved participants' news veracity discernment. Specifically, the false alarm rate decreased, whereas the hit rate was unaffected. This pattern of responding resulted in higher B prime D values because the overall proportion of responses exceeding the upper criteria, those associated with scale values greater than 1, decreased. So all that this last part is saying is the same as this, that the B prime D values are determined by the sum of the hit and false alarm rates. So what were the key findings? Participants in the treatment condition showed better discrimination than participants in the control condition, although the Bayesian evidence was only anecdotal. And this better discrimination in the treatment compared to the control was solely driven by a decrease in false alarm rates, so better identification of fake news. Now, we are planning another experiment that aims to boost this effect, specifically because of the anecdotal evidence. So we're thinking of adding things like learning context, so actually telling participants why they're learning what they're learning, gamification to try and boost motivation, and also mastery. So there's some evidence that if you keep testing people until they get everything correct, so 100% correct in the training blocks, that can improve inductive learning. But we are open to suggestions. So if anyone has any ideas, I'm happy to hear them. So a quick summary of what I've talked about. First, I looked at current gamified interventions designed to help people spot fake news. And we found in our paper that gamified inoculation interventions do not improve discrimination. They simply cause a more conservative response bias. Then I looked at the type of knowledge behind true and fake news discrimination. And we found that tacit knowledge seems to form the dominant basis of true and fake news discrimination, and that it's typically improved through repeated practice. And finally, I talked about using inductive learning to improve true and fake news discrimination. And we tried this out, and the results are promising, but there definitely is room for improvement and more testing and replications that need to occur. Thank you so much for listening. And I really look forward to any questions or comments or ideas. Don't know whether to stop sharing.
Thank you, Ariana.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll open it up for discussion now. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments, or just jump in. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. On the first part, the discrimination data, have you looked at other outcome measures such as sharing, for example, or discernment of technique? Because as you may know, I mean, I don't do the games. I don't know anything about that. Well, I just read the papers. But we do the videos, which are sort of similar. And in all the stuff that we have done and we have published, we find discernment. So it's not a criterion effect. And so I wonder that it might be a difference between the games and the videos, or it might be that it really depends very intricately on the measure that you're looking at. And so that's why I'm just wondering, have you looked at other measures?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So we didn't, because it was just a reanalysis. So we literally just took the measures that they did in their own studies.
And they didn't look at sharing? They didn't ask for... okay.
No. So the outcome measures that they did was belief. So they looked at means of the mean belief in true news and the mean belief in fake news. So we just took the raw ratings that they did and just reanalyzed those. So they didn't look at sharing, and we just focused on that one outcome measure, which was their main outcome measure. So no, we haven't looked at sharing discernment, but that's something that we also find very interesting. Hopefully something we can definitely do down the line. Unfortunately, my PhD topic isn't about sharing, and it's more about belief, so discrimination, which is why we're focusing on that at the moment. But I think there are some studies showing that, you know, the belief doesn't necessarily equal sharing, right? So that's very...
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
So that's very interesting, because clearly we might find something different. And I think you mentioned your studies on the videos. Obviously, right off the bat, videos are quite different to games, but also you mentioned that they improved discernment. And I'm just wondering, what kind of measures did you use for that?
Well, we had a number of measures. We had sharing intention. We had our emphasis was on teaching people to detect when they're being misled. Right. So we looked at technique recognition. Is this item misleading, or whatever we asked them? I can't remember the wording. And in those cases, of course, it was important to verify that it isn't criterion shift. And the way we did it was, we didn't use an RLC analysis, but we used, because it was I can't remember why. I'd have to look back at the details of the responses, but we certainly found an increase in discrimination between the true and the false stuff, or the misleading and not misleading stuff. So it isn't just that they say, oh, everything is misleading now, right? Now teach them how to detect it. So we do find discernment, to the best of my knowledge. We also find an effect on accuracy that is, there's a discernment component in an unpublished study using the videos, combined with an accuracy prime. So, to my knowledge, there's a lot of stuff out there that is showing discernment. And so, but that doesn't mean, that the games may not do it that way, or that there's something else that's going on. But remind me why you find no difference in the RSE curves, but the Cambridge folks find a difference in means?
Well, because it's a completely different analysis. Means essentially conflate discrimination and response bias.
Well, that's what I don't understand. Because they did it separately for false and true items?
Yes, but response bias and discrimination can affect mean ratings differentially. So signal detection theory essentially assumes like underlying distributions for true news and fake news. But these distributions aren't always exactly the same. So a response bias, we're actually writing a paper on this now using simulations, where we find that if there's a conservative response bias in these sort of experiments, they actually shift responses to fake news more so than they do to true news. And that's just how it works. We've simulated the data and we found this. So hopefully once we get it out there, we can share it. But so the response bias is going to affect the two different distributions differentially, because they're not going to be exactly identical.
Yeah, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but it's kind of hard to do it without like the graphs. But you essentially have a true news distribution and a fake news distribution for signal detection theory, and response bias can differentially affect both. So in this case, we found by using simulations that if you have a conservative response bias, it shifts those fake news responses more than it does true news. And so this can make it seem like, just looking at the means, that the means for true news haven't shifted that much, but the means for fake news have shifted a lot. But that's just a response criterion change.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, Marvin.
So thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm wondering if you could, or if you have a take on the effectiveness of strategies that seem to promote analytical thinking explicitly, like sourcing or more precisely lateral reading.
Yeah, analytical thinking is not really my area, but I think there's a lot of work going into this, right? I think Pennycook and Rand are doing a lot of analytical stuff. So yeah, it's not really my area. I don't know exactly what would help analytical thinking. I'm not sure if it's something that is also just a little bit innate in a sense. I think you're probably more well versed in that than me. But yeah, sorry, I can't give a more holistic answer to that.
I wanted to ask, maybe you can go back to the last point when you said that you mentioned this even in the reanalysis of the Cambridge group, and I was wondering in how many studies did you find this pattern? Like, was it something that was across the across all studies, or was it in a particular study?
It was just one, actually. We only found that in one out of the 13 reanalyses, and it was their first ever study on bad news, which is quite interesting. So it was their 2019 paper where we did find a significant increase in discrimination, but we also found that significant increase in B'-Ds, but that was just because the false alarm rates decreased. And so by just the false alarm rates decreasing, the B'-D values are inflated. And it doesn't mean that there's a shift in response bias. It just means that there's discrimination because they've become better at detecting fake news. And we actually, so that's one of the studies that showed, it was that study and also the two that had that different test items for the follow-up test and the pre-test and the post-test. Those showed better discrimination. And obviously the ones with the follow-up test, it was because of the items. And this one as well was due to item effects because they had two true news items that were really obvious. So I think it was Trump is going to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. And the other one was Brexit is going to happen. Whereas the fake news items were completely created by the researchers. So there was no prior knowledge involved for the fake news items, but there was for the true news. So you can imagine that if there's a response bias effect, I mean, a response bias is only going to affect so much, right? If you know that Brexit is happening, no amount of response biases can change your belief in that. So we also tend to find that was due to item effects, but that was the only situation where we found an improvement in discrimination, but also an inflation in B'-D values. Yeah.
Rob.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great talk, thanks. So
yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the second experiment. So you looked at how effective these different strategies were, and is it possible that some participants used different strategies, or at least report using different strategies, and it's the participants rather than the strategies themselves that are more accurate than others?
Yeah, I think our main aim wasn't to look at what strategies were more accurate. It was just to see what strategies they used. So that was, it wasn't about accuracy. It was just trying to see what they were using. And in terms of a participant level analysis, we did look at that, and the distributions were quite similar across participants. Obviously, you did have some people that, said intuition a bit more or said prior knowledge a bit more, but they were pretty consistent, which is also quite interesting. But we also looked at item level analysis because we wanted to see, well, are all of these guess responses or all of these intuition responses just driven by like 5 items or 10 items that people just always say that they're guessing to because they're really hard? But that wasn't the case either. So there was a nice distribution across all the items that guess was being picked a lot, intuition was being picked a lot, and then everything else was kind of picked a lot less. So it was really surprising to us. We thought that they would pick rules and prior knowledge a lot more, but clearly participants just say that they're completely guessing, which I don't really understand, but it's interesting.
What's interesting, because you'd think that people who, I don't know, self-report following the news more closely would use prior knowledge more often than people who report not following the news closely or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And also you'd presume that if they're discriminating quite well, that they'd report that they're using specific rules or specific prior knowledge, but that wasn't the case. So could be due to loads of things. I mean, they could also just have a very liberal guessing criterion, which is quite funny. So just like you have a liberal response bias where you rate everything as more true, you can also just be really liberal in saying that you're guessing when you're not really guessing. And that can vary between participants, as you say. But yeah, it could be due to loads of things, but we haven't really, we can't really tell just from this study.
Dawn.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to think about. Very interesting. It was a point that Rob made that made me think of this, which is so when you ask people to state their strategy, they could only pick one item, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
do you think you might find a slightly different answer if you could pick more than one? Because I can imagine saying, well, I'm not actually sure, I have to guess some of it, but based on this logic, like airlines usually do this and blah, 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 even though I have to part guess, I would want to take two strategies because I'd use both. So that's why I thought, is if you say take all that you've used, do you think you might get a different response and you might up the rules a bit more then?
Yeah, so we actually talk about this in the paper a little bit. So we, before running the experiment, we really thought about, should we have them be able to sort of on a sliding scale say how much they're using each decision strategy instead of just picking one? That was something that we considered, but we thought it would just be so messy, like having them say that they have to slide the responses and they all have to add up to 100. It's going to take them ages to do it. They're going to get annoyed. Also, how if we say, okay, you can pick two, but then should they be able to pick 3 or 4 or how many? So we thought, well, for now, we're just interested in seeing which one they're using the most. And so this experimental design fitted that purpose. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it could change things. You could also do it in a rank order sort of thing. So that was another thing we thought about. So just ranking them in terms of how much they use them, but then they might be ranking something that they're not using at all. So these are all things that we really thought about, but we couldn't come up with the perfect decision. So we went for the most simple one. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It could change things for sure.
Angelo.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. Yeah, my question is about the intuition. You mentioned this example of riding a bicycle, which is used by hands-on to regarding how we differentiate between science and pseudoscience. I mean, he says like most people, this is like riding a bicycle because most people can do it, but very few can explain how they do it, right? So it's like an intuitive, tacit knowledge, right? Mm. And I think I have been working about this idea for a couple of years, and I think it's true. I think people can basically differentiate between science and pseudoscience depending on their motivational context. And they use intuition. It's a kind of tacit knowledge we all have. But opening the black box of intuition, what do you think they mean by intuition? What are the cues they are looking? What is so intuitive? Maybe the wording, how professional the news, like I don't know, maybe the language.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. We have talked about this because I feel like a lot of what I operate off of when I look at news on the internet is just intuition. So I'll just look at something and be like, oh, that sounds a little bit dodgy. I'm going to look it up. Or I read something and I'm like, no, that sounds right. I'm just going to take that as word and not really investigate it. So I don't know. I think it might vary from person to person. But for me, I personally think that there are features that discriminate true and fake news. And I know that it's a really hot topic right now. Some people say that there's nothing that discriminates true and fake news, and it's just based on the context or prior knowledge or things that are sort of taken away from the item. But I think that there are features that discriminate the two. So I think it might be some sort of unconscious, subconscious detection of these features that just spark up like a skepticism or something that just makes you think that doesn't look right. Whether it's the thing is, I don't know, because I don't know enough about machine learning or the literature, because I know that they've been looking at the specific features that discriminate the two. And I think some of them are like punctuation, the way that they use certain words, capitalization. So maybe it's just the detection of those features that we can be quite intuitive about. But there could be so many other things that I feel a bit daft just saying that's the thing. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. Is there anything that you think might be sort of perking up in people that makes them?
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in fake news, but yeah, when you see the outlet of the usual outlets of fake news, they are obviously less professional. They look so wrong and so horrible. The wording is very bad. Yeah, so maybe when they run these experiments in controlled settings, they recreate like perfect fake news, right? And
Right.
that's why it's so it's difficult to differentiate, because the wording is different than the real thing, right? Yeah, but maybe it's something. Yeah, it's a whole line of research, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's very interesting. And well, you say that it's difficult for them to discriminate because maybe as the experimenter, you make fake news items that are really plausible, but their discrimination is like 75%, which also blows my mind because it's like clearly they can discriminate. So what's going on? They can discriminate, but they say that they're guessing or using intuition. But yeah, definitely a whole line of research here.
Right. Thank you. Do we have another question or comment? Well, if not, then Ariane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll stop the recording now.